begin simply by thanking the organizers for inviting me here today. It's a real honor and privilege and a real pleasure to be able to participate with such a distinguished group of scholars and scholars and activists and artists and writers to deal with such a difficult but clearly important topic such as this on the issues of cultural representation and the violence of Sierra Leone. So I just want to thank them for that. My discussion today is on visual art, but not the visual art that we'll be seeing in the gallery later. Instead, I'm looking largely at paintings that were done in the public arena in 1993, during the early years of the Civil War in Sierra Leone. And if you'll remember, you may be familiar either through some of the publications that have come out from Sierra Leone. I know Paul Richards' book, Fighting for the Rainforest, he addresses this particular period of artwork in his book. But in 1993, beginning in January, about 6-7 months after the military coup led by Valentin Strasser and the NPRC, young men, primarily undereducated and underemployed, led this massive public arts campaign in which they covered vast swaths of the public walls of Freetown and Bo and some of the other major cities of the country with really incredible murals and a series of portraits that depicted figures from the Sierra Leonean past, from the larger Pan-African political imaginary, as well as individuals and figures from the global popular culture which captured these young men's imagination. And the painting movement was remarkable for a lot of different reasons. I can't get into all of it here, but it was a particularly, I think, vibrant moment where we have a lot of young men who, for the most part, would be the ones who would most likely be conscripted into the war that was, at that point, really just sort of getting its legs, so to speak. I mean, the RUF had made its first major incursion into the diamond mining region just in the couple months past. And, but nevertheless, there's this moment where these young men, who'd largely been marginalized from politics in the years past, who were really taking this moment to imagine a more utopian future for the country. And is really taking this period of optimism and trying to formulate some new vision of the Sierra Leonean nation state that could get out of, could move beyond the years of the corrupt APC regime under Joseph Momo and Shaka Stevens, as well as to move beyond Foday Senko's guerrilla movement. My attempt isn't just to rehash the work that Joe Apala has done on this particular movement in his book Ecstatic Renovation, which offers a nice overview of the movement as a whole, but to look at one individual in particular that gained a certain prominence in the visual arts movement as a whole. And this is just one example of some of the images that appeared all across Freetown and Bo and some of the other cities. And this is out on Wilkinson Road in the rather wealthy west end of the city. And here's another image by the painter Elisan Bangura at work. And he's actually painting on the outside walls of the Pedemba Road prison in central Freetown. And this is another image of Bangura. But my interest in particular is with this figure he's painting here, Sengbe Pie, who gained a certain kind of prominence in the movement. His image was one of the central ones that was represented over and over again by various artists who were working across the city. And there were at least a dozen, if not more, images of him that appeared in Freetown, and then I know also in Bo as well, there was a lot of interest in him. Additionally, Sengbe Pie, if you know, led the 1839 Amistad slave revolt, which, if you haven't seen Steven Spielberg's film Amistad, or the Freetown Players play Amistad Kata Kata, or even Raymond de Souza George's play The Broken Handcuff, you'll know that the revolt took place off the Cuban coast. It involved about 50 recently enslaved Africans who were all from what is now the nation state of Sierra Leone. And currently, it certainly wasn't then, but they're all mostly from the Mende region in the south. And, they were successful in taking over the slave ship, but unfortunately, they simply didn't know how to sail. I mean, they were mostly farmers or small tradesmen, and, navigating a ship wasn't exactly their forte. So instead of making their way back to West Africa, they ended up floating up the North American coast, where they were eventually arrested and captured off the coast of Long Island, were jailed on piracy and murder charges. But fortunately, with the help of anti-slavery abolitionists, their legal case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where they ultimately prevailed and were able to return to West Africa. So, I mean, it's a remarkable story given the history of the slave trade, to what we know about it. So my interest in this paper, then, is to address how the artists in Freetown in 1993 used the image of Sengbe-Pied to negotiate amongst themselves and with the wider community how best to articulate their urban ethics of self-determination, rebelliousness, masculine homosociality, and diasporic cosmopolitanism in order to produce a political vision for the social organization of the Sierra Leonean nation-state in the wake of the NPRC's military coup the year before and of the rebel war that was growing in intensity in the south and east of the country at that point. Sengbe-Pied's preeminence in the panoply of heroes that emerged points to how the artist's mind collected memory to give meaningful historical narrative structures to contemporary practices of violence. The youth regularly linked the Amistad revolt leader visually to Captain Valentin Strasser, the leader of the NPRC military government, thus intimately connecting past and present by telling us that Strasser, like Sengbe-Pied, had led an honorable and just revolt in order to end tyranny. And clearly the tyranny at that point was largely that of Joseph Momo and the years of the APC military regime. But there's also the rebel war at that point was very much part of the same sentiments of ending tyranny. By associating the two men, the young painters explored how to most effectively remember and construct a useful memory or useful meaning from a national history in which slavery, forced labor, colonialism, racism, post-colonial despotism, and Revolutionary United Front's terror loomed large. Sengbe-Pied's prominence, I want to argue, reveals a complex engagement on the part of the young artists with the problems of the violence of nation-state-based subjectivity. But I also want to point out, also with transnational modernity, which is to say globalization, in post-colonial Sierra Leone. For as much as the youths defined Sengbe-Pied as a Sierra Leonean warrior hero capable of ending tyranny, fascination with him resided at least as much in his status as a hero of an American-centered Black Atlantic history. By interpreting Sengbe-Pied as a model for a transnational rather than a strictly national subjectivity, the young artists struggled to articulate a new form of identification based on their own cosmopolitan values that could avoid the conflicts of Sierra Leone's recent past. And it would take days to get into sort of the where this sort of cosmopolitanism and sort of global imagination the youth had. But there's been some good work done on it, and I think Don might be speaking at least briefly to it in his paper next. What I most want to emphasize here, though, today is that at the same time, Sengbe-Pied's elevation in the youth pantheon suggests that the artists were struggling to link Sierra Leone's internal conflicts, at least in part to the political and economic stratifications of late 20th century globalization. With this next slide, let me show you one example of how the artists, at least one artist, worked through some of the issues around transnationalism and globalization in the context of Sierra Leone during the early 1990s. The artist of this portrait, Josie Lahai, painted as a member of the Savage Square Youths Organization, deep in Freetown's densely populated and impoverished East End. His images were on the Bishop Johnson School, is that right? Not too far from the dockyards there in the East End. Lahai, like other artists, took his image, and you'll see how similar this one is to the previous one we saw by Alassane Bangura. Lahai and all the other artists took their inspiration from this 19th century portrait by the American abolitionist Nathaniel Jocelyn, who was very much involved in the legal struggle to free the Amistad Africans in 1930 to 1940, and was largely disseminated in Sierra Leone through this publication, which, if you're familiar with it, is a book called Sierra Leonean Heroes, and it was published and produced largely by Joseph Momo's presidential office, first in 1987, and then a more extended version of it came out in 1988. And the book is a collection of autobiographical sketches of significant figures from the Sierra Leonean past. And despite the relatively small circulation of the book, I'm not sure if there were even 15,000 copies printed, the image in particular took on a life of its own, and gained a certain kind of iconic status in Sierra Leone during the 1980s, and bolstered in part by Charlie Hafner's very popular play Amistad Kata Kata. And for lots of reasons, the iconography of it gains a certain kind of importance when we look at images like the one that Lahai created, because Lahai is working on a certain kind of indigenization of the image, putting him in the blue and white striped country cloth of the Mende in the south. He gives him a walking stick, which the artist claims is a chiefly Mende walking stick. I haven't done that kind of ethnographic work to verify, but replaces the bamboo cane in this 19th century original. Clearly replaces the white toga that Jocelyn gave it. Trying to figure out where I want to be here. I could go on about the ways in which the indigenization here actually serves as an emphasis on the ways in which Sengbe Pieh was very much a global figure, and Lahai talks about his significance very much in global terms as being part of this Black Atlantic history. And what I find most compelling about Lahai's political usage of the iconic image stems from his emphasis on the global aspects of Sengbe Pieh's significance, the way that the U.S. was shaped and affected, however limited fashion, by the history of the revolt. But nevertheless, he is part of this larger Black Atlantic history. And so this emphasis on the global, what I'm interested in is how the global is then turned back to look at local conflicts of the early 1990s. In an interview I conducted with Lahai, he repeatedly indicated that Sengbe Pieh bridged politically and historically Sierra Leone with the United States. And when I asked him to elaborate, he gave me a very fascinating response that says a great deal about how Sierra Leoneans, at least the segment of society that was involved in this particular arts movement, responded to the shadow that the U.S. as a global power casts over the country, and how, in a sense, Sengbe Pieh symbolizes that political relationship. And I've given you two quotes from my interview with Lahai, and I'm going to quote now from the second one, the longer one. And I'm going to skip over parts of it, so if you want to read along, be aware that I'm going to kind of jump over significant sections of it. Lahai states, first of all, young Sierra Leoneans, most of us are ambitious. We're thinking, you go to school, come to the United States, because the United States is really the heaven where you come, educate yourself, and go back to Sierra Leone. Get a good job, have your family, live well. And I interviewed him. He was living in Atlanta at the time I interviewed him, so the references are about the U.S. from the position of being in the U.S. So now, when we thought about Sengbe Pieh and the connection to the United States, we thought other Sierra Leoneans have come to the U.S. and survived and succeeded. Sengbe Pieh was one of those. Came to a country like this where he doesn't even know any law, and he still, with the help of other people, survived and succeeded. So we youngsters thought the connection between Sierra Leone and the United States, we thought having this connection was a great thing, that one day Sierra Leoneans would have easy access to the United States, like United States people have easy access to Sierra Leone. We thought, if we have people who have come to the United States and lived here and worked here in the United States and survived and do it young, then any other Sierra Leonean could do it. So it was more like a morale booster for young Sierra Leoneans. And I'll stop there, but if you look on, you can see where this actually leads him to talking about the historical connections between West Africans and Sierra Leoneans in particular, and diasporic Africans who trace their history back through the transatlantic slave trade. And he even mentions Alex Haley's roots as a model for some sort of connection that Sengbe Pieh also symbolizes. The implications of Lahai's statements are fascinatingly complicated for all they reveal about desire, social status, and the stratifications of power and dominance. But for the sake of keeping within a reasonable time allotment, I'll just highlight two themes. First, Lahai's reference to the U.S. as the privileged location for education and status achievement underscores how Sengbei Pie symbolizes for him the worldly and cosmopolitan subjectivities valued by the youth, and there are points that I didn't quote on the connections, like the roots-like connections. That Lahai identifies the U.S. as the privileged site for attaining worldliness, though, clearly raises troubling questions about global power hierarchies. And this gets us to the second theme, namely how Sengbei Pie signifies the possibility of successfully resisting American assertions of regional and racial dominance. Lahai's repeated insistence that success in the U.S. amounts to survival belies his description of the country as a heaven for Sierra Leoneans. Likewise, his reference to the limited access that Sierra Leoneans have to entering the U.S. in opposition to Americans' relatively easy access to Sierra Leone underscores his recognition of the relations of dominance that disadvantage Africans politically and economically and on the global terrain. Sengbei Pie, who refuses to submit to an earlier manifestation of globalization or global dominance, then comes to symbolize the possibility of subverting America's authority and coming away the more powerful for it. But for Lahai and other painters, this global fascination was ultimately turned back on the Sierra Leonean nation-state in an attempt to articulate a response to the conflict engendered by Foday Sankoh's guerrilla activities. In the first quote that I give you, which I won't quote from, but you can take a look at it at some point, Lahai proposes that the parallels he and other painters saw between the Amistad Rebellion and the NPRC's coup d'etat motivated them to depict the 19th century revolt leader as their principal icon. And it's very much, because Sengbei Pie and Valentin Strasser were conceived of as being kinsmen, or Sengbei Pie was sort of an ancestor symbolically to Foday Sankoh, oh my God. Valentin Strasser, quite the opposite. And a spokesperson for one of these youth groups who was involved in the painting campaign actually exclaimed, quote, "Sengbei Pie and Captain Strasser are the same person, both revolutionaries." And that quote I got from Opala's book, Ecstatic Liquidation. And so for the period from the 1992 coup through the first half of 1993, while the painting campaign was going on, and this is before disillusionment with the NPRC began to set in, which came relatively quickly, Strasser was considered by these young men involved in the painting campaign to be a consummate soldier and national leader. And Sengbei Pie was his mirror, reflecting the attributes of selflessness, discipline, tactical acumen, political savvy, and above all, youthful vigor. Sengbei Pie's appeal as a warrior, however, I want to suggest, resulted only partially from the popularity of the NPRC military regime. Because Sengbei Pie's decisive armed response against his Spanish enslavers in 1839 offered a model of resistance to a country embroiled in a violent conflict with Foday Sankoh's guerrilla forces. The country's now youth, as I mentioned, many of these relatively impoverished young men from Freetown involved in the arts campaign were among the war's most likely combatants, and as a result were especially preoccupied with issues of violence and warfare. This is something that Paul Richards and other people have gotten into in various kinds of publications. For Sengbei Pie then to successfully resist an enslavement that millions of others could not, and to return thousands of miles to his homeland, made him a powerful example to these young men who faced entering into a battle from which few would return alive, or at least unscarred or unscathed. As a result, I found that there was a real attempt to translate the moral authority that Sengbei Pie gains in his success in resisting slavery and actually acting out against slavery, to take this moral authority, this moral legitimacy, and sort of translate it to the militaristic aspects of the Sierra Leonean society or the political context at that moment. And this is something I want to talk about with this final image. painting under the name Deghul, Amadou Tarawali, who I believe there's some paintings from him in today's, or the gallery exhibit going on right now. He was also very active in this arts campaign, and this is one of his paintings. Painting under the name Deghul, Tarawali explores the combat implications of Sengbei Pie's warrior heroism in fascinating ways to address explicitly the government's war against the RUF-SL's civil insurgency. On Jones Street in the western middle-class reaches of central Freetown, Deghul places Sengbei Pie in the blue striped cloth of his Mende ethnic group, much like Baha'i did in the image we saw earlier, but replaces the bamboo cane in the 19th century original with a spear. I think it's significant. There's clearly more of a spear, certain emphasis on a kind of violence here, or at least militarism. Along the left side of the portrait, as you can't really see here in this image, it's not showing up particularly well. Deghul borders his work with the green, white, and blue stripes of the Sierra Leone flag, lest we forget the national implications of his work. Right, as we can see, he includes the names and flags of the 5 member nations of the ECOMOG peacekeeping force that was based in Sierra Leone at the time, fighting mostly in neighboring Liberia against Charles Taylor's incursions or attempt to take over Liberia. The flags form an X shape with Sierra Leone at the center, wrapped in an improvised ECOMOG banner, which I think is a very provocative comment on Sierra Leone's place in the broader regional and one might even say global terrain. Clearly there's an element of protection. Sierra Leone is almost being protected by the other countries, but at the same time suggests Sierra Leone's centrality to the stability of the region. By a chain of visual associations generated in these images, I want to argue that Deghul links Sengbei Pie through the multinational peacekeeping ECOMOG force to the RUF-SL's brutally violent rebellion in Sierra Leone, but linked importantly through the destructive aspects of globalization and nation-state-based politics, which is to say ultimately through Charles Taylor, who the ECOMOG was fighting, but who clearly, sort of popular discourse in Sierra Leone identified as being very much behind Foday Senghor's activities in the south and east of the country at that point. If not the mastermind of it, at least there was discussion that he seemed to be coordinating aspects of it in exchange for the diamonds that at that point had only just started coming out of the country through the RUF, because they'd only actually at that point really just taken over the diamond mining fields. But nevertheless, it was difficult to talk about ECOMOG without talking about Charles Taylor, without then talking about Foday Senghor. So in a sense, I think there's an undercurrent to this particular image of the diamond trade, which is to say the dark underbelly of globalization and all of the violence, corruption, and terror associated with it in Sierra Leone. With the spear that Deghul places in Sengbei Pie's hands then, one might interpret Sengbei Pie in this painting as a moral authority and guiding spirit for those young Sierra Leoneans taking up weapons of their own against Foday Senghor's, we might say, morally corrupt, even enslaving and despotic campaign of terror. The Amistad revolt leaders' fight for freedom against enslavement morphs into the Sierra Leonean people's contemporary fight against servitude to a tyrannical overlord. And in conclusion then, I would say then that Sengbei Pie's combat narrative thus serves to give meaning and shape to contemporary military action, at least in this particular image. And I never really prepared a conclusion for this talk, hoping that one would come to me. And I still don't really have a conclusion, but I will finish with Deghul's image here. And just to sort of reiterate that in these early years of the war, 1993, we're looking at about 2.5 years, or 2 years after the war has really started. There was a tremendous sense of optimism, and there really was sort of a utopian sort of fervor, at least among these young men, that I think it's easy to forget now after the intervening 10 years have passed, and we see the kind of images in the paintings in the gallery here today. I think it's worth remembering that many of these young men who have in many ways gotten very much demonized and vilified in Sierra Leone, and certainly in the international press, Life magazine, Time magazine, that they're very actively attempting to shape an alternative future. And I think that's what's so interesting in mining the past and looking to their history to do so. So with that, I will conclude. And thank you very much for your attention.